So the notes you're getting today will get us through verse 17 through 20. 17 through 20. And that's the part where Jesus says, don't think that I've come to destroy the law. I came not to destroy, but to fulfill. We're going to talk about that. Along with his statement, and unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the Pharisees, you can't enter the kingdom of heaven. So we're going to figure out what that means. Do some research on that. Think about it. Jot down some notes. Put down your own thoughts. And we'll talk about that next week. But today we're in verses 13 through 16 of Matthew chapter 5, the Sermon on the Mount. Appreciate Don and Dad handing those out. Okay. If you haven't already, open your Bible to Matthew chapter 5. Let's begin by reading verses 13 through 16. And then we'll talk about where we are, and then we'll open up our discussion from the questions. Verse 13. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. Okay, so we've only been in a few weeks, but I feel like we've already come a long way because we had sort of a semi-introduction, and then we had a real formal introduction when we looked at verses 1 and then chapter 7, verses 24 through the end of the chapter, where we sort of set the stage for the Sermon on the Mount. It's all about establishing the authority of Jesus, teaching us to be different. We're supposed to be set apart from the world. We kind of get some of that in today's lesson. And then we spent the next 2 weeks on the Beatitudes, and we finished that up. A look at mental dispositions that Jesus requires of us. They are in opposition to what the world would say are important. These things, the Beatitudes. But now we come to a section, your heading may say, mine says believers are salt and light, but we could probably more appropriately just label this, it's a section about Christian influence. So we're going to talk about Christian influence. And if you have the notes, we'll just base our study off of the questions, the discussion questions, but we'll take a look at a lot under each one of those. So here was the first question. When you read this section, I guess the first question we could ask is, how important is influence? Semi-important, not at all, extremely important. Where would you grade influence for a Christian? Extremely important. Why? Why would we say it's extremely important for a Christian? Okay, we're representing Christ. Somebody over here said something? Okay. Yeah, so there's a demonstration we're making to the world that we're Christians. Any other thoughts about the importance of it? Yeah, Art? Okay. Okay, so there's no real way to distinguish ourselves away from the world unless there's a way of exerting Christianity in an influential way on the world. He does say in Matthew 5, verse 13, we're going to talk about this a little bit more, but look at verse 13. He says, how shall it be seasoned? And that's in relationship to if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? What's the implication of that statement when he says, how shall it be seasoned? What's he saying there? Yeah, keep on being the light and the salt. Yeah, is he saying something about influence here that tells us about the importance of it? That he says, if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It's then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot of men. What's that tell us about influence? Very good. Totally agree. If good influence is lost, is it sometimes really difficult to gain a reputation back once you've lost it? Sometimes you never get it back. And so he's telling us about the importance of influence by saying, you always have to be on your best behavior. You always have to do what's right. Because if you lose it, it's sometimes very difficult to regain your influence. So it's telling us about the importance of it. Hold your place here. Just put a peg in it, put a Bible ribbon marker. We're going to come right back. Go with me to Proverbs chapter 22. I think this is very appropriate to what Joel is saying. Proverbs chapter 22. Proverbs 22. Let's take a look at verse 1 together. A good name is to be chosen rather than great riches, loving favor rather than silver and gold. And that's not the way the world thinks. But he says your reputation, your good name, is worth more than all the gold and silver in the world. And that fits right along with what he's talking about in the Sermon on the Mount, to say that you have this treasure that can be so easily lost. And a good reputation is so important. But if you lose your influence, it is very difficult to restore it. Now, the second part of the question was this. Does everybody have influence, or is influence only something that is the product of good action? Everybody's got influence, which means if you don't have good influence, what kind of influence do you have? You've got bad influence. And I think sometimes we forget that if we're not doing the right thing, we think, well, at least, at the moment I don't have good influence. But the truth is, if you don't have a good influence, you're exerting bad influence at the moment. And we've got all kinds of Bible examples of both good influence and bad influence, of the tragedy of not having good influence. And I jotted a few down, and one of those is because we were doing in we have a family Bible time each night. We were talking about the story of Esther. Esther, good influence or bad influence? Good influence. You think of, she steered the course of history by just standing up and being courageous, but that was great influence. And she had such a profound influence on Artaxerxes that he could have put her to death. And she walks right in, and he accepts her into the court, and she sets this up, and the plan is ultimately revealed, and she destroys Haman's plot to kill the Jews. It's just an amazing story about good influence. And then I was thinking of Paul and Silas are in a jail. They've been beaten. They're bleeding. They're in the inner prison, and they're singing songs to God. And when all the commotion happens, the jailer goes, "What must I do to be saved?" And that's all based on the influence of Paul and Silas. But then you have examples of bad influence in the Bible. Can you think of some folks that had bad influence? Jezebel would be, I don't know, if there's a top 10 list, like FBI's top 10 most wanted, she'd be right up there at the top. Jezebel was a wicked, wicked woman, but she had terrible influence on the nation. Any other examples of bad influence? Yeah, Joel? Sure. Yeah, Solomon did a lot of things that were just not right. One, he had terrible advisors. And then on top of that, there's even a statement in 1 Kings 11, I believe, where it says, of all the wives that he had, and they turned his heart away from the Lord, they just had terrible influence over him. So I think it proves that influence is a really fragile thing. It's really important because a good name is better than great riches, and it's easily lost. You can lose a reputation quickly. Art? Yeah. Yes. Yeah. That's right. That's right. That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah. I think so. I think it's exactly right. Good illustration on that. Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, and I think it kind of goes back to what Art was talking about earlier. We forget that if we're not exerting a constant positive influence, then we're actually exerting bad influence. And some of it is that we're going to talk about this in a minute, our salt and light, it's been corrupted. And so now what we're exerting is a corrupted influence. It's adulterated in some sense. Okay, so let's go to question number 2. Jesus in Matthew 5 uses salt and light. And this is more of a, not really getting into the meaning of it, but more generic, more practical. Why do you think Jesus used salt and light as symbols of influence? Why would he do that? Yeah. Does Jesus not have a habit when we're reading Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and Paul even does the same thing, but Jesus was the master of it. He's constantly using everyday things that people related to, things that were common in their life. And he did that because it made the truth that much easier to understand. And so he's a master of using very familiar, everyday objects to illustrate deep spiritual truths. The parables are great examples of that because he would use something that was an activity that was part of everyday life or an object that was part of everyday life. And salt and light culturally were very familiar items. So that brings us to number 3. So we want to dig into number 3 a little bit, Tom. Sure. Yeah, not worth a grain of salt. Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. So I think that's a good point. He's not just using something that has the practical value of teaching influence. He's also teaching something about the value of it as well. So those illustrations very, very well brought that out. Okay. So here's number 3, and this is where we're going to get down into the actual meaning of it. What does he mean when he says this? So number 3, consider Matthew 5, verse 13. This is part of your notes. What is Jesus' point, and is there a warning about our influence? We kind of already covered the warning part, but what's he saying here in verse 13? You're the salt of the earth. If the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It's then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot of men. I don't know if you did some digging around. What did you come up with on Matthew 5, 13? Yeah, I think that's a good point, Carl. Yeah, so if we're not exerting it, then it's useless, right? So that's one thing we get out of that. Any other thoughts on this? Now, when we typically use this passage, how do we typically use it? And I'm not saying the typical use is wrong, but there's a deeper meaning to it. Doris? Sure? Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Absolutely, yeah. It's sort of standing on the edge of a knife. We could influence people the wrong way, but we have the power to influence even bad people the right way. When we think of salt, how do we think of it typically? So, okay, as a seasoning, right? Typically that's how we think of it, right? Because that's our common everyday use of salt. So we think when we tend to think of salt, it's either sitting by cookware and we're putting it into a recipe because it calls for it, or it's on the table and we're seasoning our food with it. And when we use salt that way, for example, if we're saying Matthew 5, 13 through 16, it's like table salt, then what would be the meaning of that? What's the application of it? Yeah, so Christianity makes the world more palatable, right? It makes the message of Jesus palatable because it's like a flavor, right, that we add to food. And salt is also a preservative. Now, we don't use it as much that way, but I remember Dad telling stories when they would grow up, when they would kill a hog, it would be saturated in salt because it would preserve the meat. And so in that same perspective, when you have Christianity in the world, it's a preservative to the world, right? It's what maybe staves off the wrath of God because there's still Christian influence in the world. But I think there's still a little bit deeper meaning in the text. And the reason I say that is because we actually have, this is one of the passages where we actually have some supplemental commentary from the Sermon on the Mount by another writer. So let's hold our place and go with me to Luke chapter 14. Luke chapter 14. Let's turn our Bibles to Luke 14. Luke chapter 14. Verse 34 and 35. The last two verses of Luke chapter 14. Okay, verse 34. Salt is good. Okay, and he's going to tell us how it's good. But if the salt has lost its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? Now that's very, very parallel to Matthew's account. And they're not in contradiction. We're just learning a little bit deeper what the meaning of the salt is. So we have the first part that tells us, what, like Matthew, it's a good thing, and it's good for nothing if it's lost its flavor. And then comes this last part, verse 35. It is neither fit for the land nor for the dunghill, but men throw it out. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. So we actually get the two applications in this passage that Jesus intended for those people in the first century. They had some common applications of salt. And he's kind of telling us what kind of salt it is and how it was used. And we have two applications. One is the earth, the soil, and the other is the dunghill. So let's try to figure out what in the world he means by that. First of all, here's a question. The salt they used, where do you think most of it came from? The Dead Sea. I don't know if you, and I've never been over, it's one of those trips of a lifetime. We're going to wait till the girls get older and hopefully things are more calm, in that area. But I would love to go over, and I've seen pictures of people that have gone over, and one of the things they do is they get in the Dead Sea, and when they jump in, none of them need life preservers because you just float. The salt content is so high. I think it's 28% salt solution when you jump into the Dead Sea. And in the first century, they would literally just go scrape buckets of salt up. The interesting thing is that the salt in the Dead Sea was not pure sodium chloride, like you'd use on, have table salt, mostly sodium chloride. It's largely potassium chloride, which is what we call potash. You ever heard of potash? Yeah, if you're a gardener, you need a couple of things. In fact, when you look for fertilizers, you can talk to Terry, who knows all about how to get a yard going and moving it. You kind of really need three things in fertilizers. You need phosphate, which really helps the roots. You need nitrate, which helps the leaves. But then you need potash, which helps the production of the flowers and the fruit. So you kind of have a couple of illustrations of this that Jesus is using, because when you have potassium chloride, you can use it as a fertilizer, right, which helps the soil and promotes the growth of good things, but it's also a disinfectant, which prevents the growth of bad things. And in this passage, he uses both of those, because he goes, it is not fit for the earth, all right, and you put the potassium chloride in the earth, the potash in the earth, because it helps things grow. You want good things to grow. But you also use potassium chloride to prevent the growth of bad things when he says the dunghill. Now here's what they did in the first century. They didn't have, they weren't even sophisticated enough. I say sophisticated, they just had what they had. They didn't even have an outhouse, right, in the first century. Behind your dwelling, you would just have a pile of dirt. And you would do your business in a pile of dirt. And what you would have is a box of potash. You would have a box of salt from the Dead Sea very nearby. And when you were done doing what you did on this pile of dirt, you would sprinkle salt over the top of it. What was the purpose of that? It's a disinfectant, right? That was the first century Lysol. That's what they did. They basically neutralized the harmful things inside of that, because it was human waste, and they would do that. And so it would prevent the growth of bad things that they did not want to grow. Now, you think about that in terms of Christianity, because we're supposed to be so influential as salt that we are promoting the growth of good things in the world and disallowing the growth of bad things in the world. That's what Christianity is supposed to do, because we are salt, and that is the illustration that he uses. Now, we just talked about some of the ways that we do that. Think about the Beatitudes. If we practice the Beatitudes, which follows directly in the Lord's teaching, and we're poor in spirit, and we're meek, and we're merciful, and we're trying to be peacemakers, do those things promote the growth of good things in this world? Yeah. Does it also prevent the growth of bad things that we don't want to grow in the world? And so in that way, Christian influence has both a positive and a negative effect, right? Because we're disallowing the growth of bad things, and we're increasing the growth of good things. Now, for example, in a kitchen, when you use salt, how much do you use in a recipe? Yeah, just a little bit. But if you're using it in the world, how much do you need? Shovels full. You need a lot. Right? So we use it because it's proportionate to what it's being used in. You need a lot in the world. And we need it everywhere, right? You have to have salt. You have to have it in your workplace. And we have to have it in our families. And we have to have it in sports. And there has to be salt in politics. It has to be everywhere, because we are the salt of the earth. It's supposed to go everywhere. And society demands a certain portion of salt to promote good and stop the bad. I think of it this way, we might engage in an occasional conversation and win an argument with somebody. But true or false, the world is deteriorating. Is that true or false? It's in decay. Our world is in chaos. Can you think of a reason why it's in chaos? There's not enough salt in the world. That's the reason. And Jesus is telling us right here, it is the presence of salt. It is the presence of salt that keeps the bad things in this world that we don't want to grow from growing. And the fact that they're growing means there's not enough salt in the world. You look at Romans 1, 18 to 32, when he's talking about people that didn't want God and their knowledge anymore, and they gave themselves over to all kinds of things. The only reason that can grow in a world is if there's not enough salt. So there has to be distribution of salt. It has to be in contact with the earth for it to work, right? You can have a box of salt, and you can put a box of salt right by a dunghill. Is it going to do anything if you don't put it on the dunghill? Will it have an effect on flowers and plants if you don't put it in the earth? It has to be in direct contact with soil. It has to be in direct contact with a dunghill in order for there to be the effect that it is supposed to produce. And the quality of it is this. Look at Matthew chapter 5 again. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt, now this is interesting, if the salt loses its flavor, can salt actually literally, chemically be other than what it is? Is it somehow, whether it's potassium chloride or sodium chloride, and you have this, and all of a sudden it is not that anymore? It's always that. It's always what it is. So the question is now, okay, so he's talked about the power of the salt. How is it possible that salt can lose its flavor? What is the only way it can do that? What is it? Okay, it's not used. How else? If it gets diluted, it loses its power, right? And so in the first century, they had this problem because a lot of folks, and Tom was talking about the value of salt. So a lot of folks in the first century, they were salt merchants, and they would go down to the Dead Sea and they would get salt, but guess what they'd scoop up with it to kind of put in there with it and make it seem like they were getting a lot more than they were? Just put sand in with it. So they just pull up sand with it, and they would sell this as I'm telling you, it's the best salt you're going to get. And when you got it and used it, it didn't work. It didn't make your plants grow. It didn't do anything to disinfect your dunghill pile in the back of your house. And so when you figured out that you had this worthless salt, you know what you did with it? Threw it out in the street. And so Jesus says, if it loses its flavor, it's then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. And that means that if influence is diluted, it's worthless. And I think that's a pretty powerful lesson for us, because Christian influence can be diluted when we live just like the world, Carl. Sure. Yeah, distortion of the message. Yeah, anything. So if this is not a powerful lesson about don't mix your service to Jesus with allegiance to the world, I don't know what is. It's a pretty powerful message that, and he's going to say it again later in Matthew chapter 6, still in the Sermon on the Mount. You can't serve two masters. You have to pick one. Because you're either going to love one and hate the other, or hate the one and love the other, but you can't serve God and mammon. You can't do both. And when we're trying to serve Jesus and trying to be Christian influence, if the world is attached to us, the salt is worthless because it's been diluted. It's been diluted. And that's such a powerful passage, especially when you connect it to Luke chapter 14. Any thoughts on that before we start talking about light? Yes, Gloria, and then Miss Jo. Sure. Yeah. People. That's right. Mm-hmm. That's right. I mean, that's a pretty strong message. Yeah. No. I mean, he says, you are the salt of the earth, and then he starts talking about worthless salt, what happens to it, but we're still the you there. And so there's the lesson to be learned that if you're mixing your salt with the world and you have no saltiness, you're good for nothing. You're going to be very careful, right? It has to come in direct contact with the dunghill, just like it does the fruit of the ground. It has to do both. But you're right, it still has to be distinguished. It still has to retain its property as a salt. It still has to retain its property as a fertilizer. It still has to do that. So it's like the old illustration of the ship and the boat, or the ship and the water, right? You put a ship in the water, and that's where it's supposed to be. But if you put water inside the ship, then you've got real problems because the water's never supposed to be inside the ship. But the ship's supposed to be in the water because it's where it's supposed to be. Miss Jo, you had your hand up. Yes, it can. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So what is in disrepair can be repaired. I don't know if you've ever put salt on a wound before. It hurts. You know, there's going to be a reaction from the world by that, but it can do that. It does do that. Okay? Very good. Now, what about light? What about light? Look at verse 14. You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, put it on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. So the question now is, considering Matthew 5, 14 and 15, what does it mean that we're a city set on a hill that can't be hid, or the light of the world? What's the illustration there, Carl? That's right. Yeah, we want to hide Christian influence. We want to be followers of Jesus, and we want to let people see that. Any other thoughts on being the light of the world? Yes. Yeah. That's right. That's right. So it's interesting you brought out John 8. If you're familiar with John 8, do you remember what happens from verse 1 down through verse 12? What's the context of that, John 8? The Pharisees took a woman, and what was she doing? She's committing adultery. And they took her, and remember that Jesus, this is the text where Jesus leans down on the ground. He writes, we don't know what he wrote, but he wrote with his finger on the ground and draws their attention. And then he turns and says, you who are without sin, cast the first stone, right? And it's interesting that, he has this conversation after with a woman. He's trying to tell them that, one, you didn't do what the law requires of you. And whatever he wrote, it's entirely possible that when he wrote on the ground, his writing was a symbol of the fact that, God wrote the Ten Commandments with his finger, remember, in stone? And so there's some symbolism there that maybe saying, I wrote this law, I can tell you what it's about, and you haven't gotten it right. But he converses with the woman at the end and says, go and sin no more, and immediately says what Joel said, I'm the light of the world. And it's a way of saying, if you had just followed light instead of darkness, you wouldn't be in this situation to begin with. So it's a very powerful passage. Light does a couple of things. What's the negative aspect of light? What does light do? Yes, it does. It illuminates falsehood and darkness. That's what it does. And then on the positive side, what does light do? Yeah, it shines the way home, okay? So light has this twofold effect in the world. In Matthew 5, verse 14, it has a negative aspect of exposing darkness, but a positive aspect of showing the right way. And what Carl was saying is the same thing as the salt. If light is hidden, what's the value of it? It's useless. It's useless if it's hidden. Salt is useless if it's not put on the earth, and it's useless if it's not put on the dunghill, and light is useless if it is hidden. Right? If you don't light it, if you somehow conceal it, it's worthless. What good is it to have that? Yeah, Terry?
Well, I don't know how many of you have ever been in total darkness. I have. You can't see your hand in front of you.
Right.
But in that, if you take a pen,
Mm-hmm.
just a small pen, it'll illuminate. I mean, you wouldn't
Powerful.
believe
Yeah.
how bright that candle
Yeah.
would appear.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
So, I mean, Christians show their light, let the light shine. I mean, those who don't think that they have that influence you do,
Mm-hmm.
if you just speak a kind word, or a smile,
Make a difference. Yeah. We've got a minute or two. I was just thinking, I don't know how true the study is. So I don't know. I'm going to go back to the salt a little bit. There was a study conducted some years ago that said, and how they understand this, how they perceive this, I don't know. Maybe they're doing like relationally, if you think of, potassium chloride and its relationship to the earth. I don't know. But they said, in a society, if a society has just 5% salt in that society, that 5% is enough to make a positive impact on society. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. But I do know this. If you have, for example, a Christian in a workplace, and you just have one Christian in a workplace, and you've got 20 people who are not Christians in a workplace, and that Christian tries doing the right thing. They don't laugh at the dirty jokes, and they don't participate in evil things, and they're kind and they're gracious like a Christian should be. Does that one Christian in a workplace, no matter how many other employees are there, does that Christian have an effect on everybody else in that workplace? Absolutely. You can change a workplace by doing that. And so the point of the Lord is, if you don't put the salt to work, or if you adulterate the salt, it won't work. It's good for nothing, like Gloria was saying. Or like Carl just said, if you hide the light, it's good. What good is it? It's meant to be out in the world. And salt affects things just by being salt. And light affects things just by being light. And so it's not, it's the very nature of the salt and the light that makes the difference in those situations. And Christians have to be seen in these passages, verse 13 and 14 of Matthew 5. We have to be seen, not in a prideful way, not in a haughty way, but the Lord expects that Christians are going to be seen as having a higher moral standard, that our way of living is different than the world. He wants the world to see that we're merciful and poor in spirit and meek and all those things that he talked about prior in the Beatitudes. He wants the world to see that, not in the prideful way that people could applaud us on the back, but he wants it because that's the way the world is affected by salt and light. Any other thoughts on light before we move on to the last question? Okay. Last question, number 5 in the notes is, what are our goals, or what is our goal in being a positive influence on the world? What are we trying to accomplish? Okay, so look at verse 16. She said, winning souls to Christ. And listen to this, verse 16. Let your light so shine before men that they see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. So the ultimate goal, right, is that God would be given glory. But what's amazing here is that it's the people who we are influencing that are giving glory to God. And that implies something. In order to give glory to God, you also have to be doing right. And so the idea is that as you shine your light in the world, again, not in a haughty way, not pretentious. It's not, he's going to condemn pretentious religion in just a few words, but he's saying, let it shine. Be the light, be the salt of the earth, and watch what happens. People will be converted. They too will become salt and light, and they will give glory to God as a result of that. So the glory is not to us. There's no credit to us, but to glory. The glory is to God because He's holy and powerful and all-knowing, and it implies their ability to come over. Now, the opposite is true. What does hypocrisy do? It destroys it. It drives people away. Right? You got Romans 2:17 and following, where Paul says, you teach people not to steal, but you steal. And you tell people not to commit sacrilege, but you commit sacrilege. And he says, by you, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles. So we have to be, this is a really, really challenging passage, because it teaches us we've got to have our stuff together, or we could do damage to the cause of Christ. Yeah, Phil?
Christ tells them that, not to be like the Pharisees. They had an outward appearance,
Yeah.
but their influence was bad
Yeah.
because of what they did.
Yeah.
So we got
That's right. In fact, he's going to follow it up. Our next section, he's going to say, unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the Pharisees, you can't enter the kingdom of heaven. So let's think about that. What's he mean by that? And then we've got just a huge controversial passage. Not controversial if we just read it the way it's intended, but in the religious world, there's this big deal over what was his relationship to the law? Jesus said, I didn't come to destroy the law, I came to fulfill it. What's that mean, and when did he do that? So we'll put a peg in it here. Next week, we'll cover verses 17 through 20 and find out about fulfilling the law. And then we'll get some new notes on the Christian and murder. And he's going to talk about that beginning in verse 21. So thank you so much for your good input. Great class today. Really, really appreciate that. Thank you.